And welcome back to the channel. We are now discussing the fourth stage in spiral dynamics, which is called blue. We are now moving from red, individual values, back to collective values. Now blue is all about traditional values and being a team player for society, and strictly obeying the customs and rules of one's civilization, in the hope that one day when he dies he will be accepted into a good spot in the afterlife, whether that be heaven, nirvana, or whatever, depending on the religion of your society that person grew up in, whether that be Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, or Hinduism. Blue is ethnocentric, patriotic, law-abiding, hard-working, and deeply religious. On the historical timeline, we can say that blue emerged in medieval Europe from 500 AD to 1500 AD. That would have been when blue was at its peak from the collapse of the Roman Empire just before the Renaissance. Blue believes that its civilization is the best and that all others are inferior, and if you disobey my civilization and any rules, you deserve a punishment. And the punishment in blue countries with tough norms and traditions could be things like the death penalty in the worst case, a severe beating, home arrest, excommunication, or life in prison. This kind of treatment is very problematic in many cases and causes harm, and when it's taken too far, it can even be a breach of human rights. But it's a big step up from red, and it keeps red people under control. Red before, where you had a dictator or cartel-run government, it was so corrupt and it was mainly focused on making all people live in fear under them. So then blue emerges when red learns, hey, wait a minute, I don't want to be governed by complete ruthless thugs. I want to be governed by well-disciplined leaders with solid principles. Now at blue is about strict customs and traditions, teaching people how to act civilized and courteous towards one another. And every action taken on a daily basis, whether it be raising your family or doing your job well, is all to serve God. And religion and discipline are the prime tools to enforce it. And with children growing up in such a society, this is enforced in all aspects of daily life. School, parenting, church, and what is allowed to be shown on TV, etc. And with discipline being the one go-to method of parenting a child, abuse is not kept in check at all, but just a normal part of life in society, and that's a huge problem even as far recent as the 1980s. Child abuse was normal all over the world. Blue values maintaining the status quo of society and how it's been for hundreds of years. They don't like change or innovation to their way of life, especially when that change is something that could encroach on their religious tradition, like science. In Blue's mind, if you have ideas that go against the status quo, you're perceived as a sinner, a traitor, and in their mind, they will justify treating you to the same standard as a criminal. Sage blue countries tend to be racist and homophobic because tolerating gays does not align with tradition, and racist because there's not really any ethnic diversity in these places, so they're not accustomed to seeing foreigners. They just value their own people, of their own ethnicity, because that's what they're used to seeing, which makes a bit of sense in historical context, because for the majority of human history, the world was not as globalized as what it is nowadays, so people of different races never really got a chance to interact with each other, unless it was through war, conflict with neighboring cultures, or just slavery, and that's how it was for hundreds of years. But if you're a foreigner and you travel to a country like this, and maybe even consider living there, I'm not saying that every or even most people you encounter will treat you horribly based on your ethnicity. Some people will, but if we're being realistic, most people will actually be nice and friendly to you. As long as you're careful not to disrespect their values, they will just treat you like one of them, if you're a kind enough person. Blue values patriarchy, so the women are there to serve the men and do exactly as they say. The men do all the work, and the way they see it, women get the benefit of that, not having to work, so they just keep at home and raise the children. And no one sees a problem with this, neither the men nor the women. It's just the hierarchy of their culture which they love. And both the men and women in these countries, they genuinely think that if it was done any other way, society would fall apart. Moving on, because blue is so stuck living in the past, there is not a lot of new technology around to make people's lives more comfortable and convenient. So just to get by, people must have a strong work ethic just to make ends meet, because innovation and technology is a sin. What I just described is how the Amish people live, but that's the most extreme example of life without technology. There are other examples like that. Blue also values mandatory military service because their idea of an oath to God and religion ties in so deeply with the idea of patriotism and defending one's homeland. Comes a very tough incentive to make your country's people, the men in particular, spend a certain number of years in the military. In fact, they are so strict they value closed borders with neighbouring countries. Now, sometimes there's a good reason for this. If neighbouring countries around you are more corrupt and full of terrorists and cartels and other dangerous people, or they simply just don't like the traditions that your nation stands for, then it's necessary just for protection. But other times it's just silly because it further promotes intolerance of other cultures. Sage Blue thinks that its holy book, whether it be the Bible, the Quran, the Torah, the Bhagavad Gita, are the absolute truth, and there is only one proper way to interpret the holy book, and any other interpretation is wrong. And there are certain authority figures that enforce the holy book, who are, quote, the interpreters of God, like the Pope or the pharaohs of Egypt, for example, and how they quote the holy book is the only right way. A blue society has a very firm hierarchy, typically found in the form of a caste system, for which everyone fits into on some level, such as the Indian caste system or the feudal system of medieval Europe, where you have the elites at the top, all the poorest people at the bottom, and all the other landowners and barons and knights and other farmers and tradespeople somewhere in the middle, along the pyramid. But these caste systems are so oppressive the further down the pyramid you go. Or it could just be a hierarchy similar to that of communist China. Now, the style of government under blue is authoritarian, theocratic, bureaucratic, and oftentimes very religious. But not in all cases. Of communist China and old Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany, the content of their belief was not religious, but the structure of the mind was all the same blue thinking. It was rigid, full of propaganda, and loved punishing those who went against the will of the government. Now, it's interesting to note here that in conventional political theory, communism, which is thought to be left, is the opposite to nationalism, which leans right. But in the context of what we're talking about here with this model, that is entirely not true at all. Because if we're talking about the old style of communism that you see in China or Soviet Russia, those governments were put in place 100 years ago. Those were not the free-loving liberals that we see in the PC Western world nowadays. They were very strict, hierarchical, and very conservative, just like the religious right wing we see in America. Now, some examples of blue countries and people are Iran, Israel, Russia, China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, medieval Europe, the Indian caste system, Islamic fundamentalism, Wahhabism, the Salvation Army, patriotism, singing the national anthem, the Catholic Church, Zen monasteries, the American right wing, Sharia law, banning abortion and birth control, anti-immigration laws, the Amish people, and last but not least, KKK and neo-Nazis. Now, the ultimate downfall of blue is that its closed-mindedness and utter rigidity, it cannot adapt to change and innovation, even when that change is necessary for its own survival, like holding back the development of new technology. And another thing is not acknowledging when the status quo is downright harmful and oppressive to certain people in society, like women, gays, poor people, and immigrants. And one last problem with blue is it doesn't recognize that its own beliefs are confused as being the absolute truth. Blue is so wrapped up in its rigid belief systems that it cannot even think about metaphysics or epistemology and experience true, genuine spirituality, which requires letting go of everything that you believe in. It can't understand that the map is not the territory. It quotes the holy book as opposed to having any real spiritual depth. And believing that heaven and hell are physical places certainly doesn't help with real mysticism and metaphysics. The whole problem with organized religion is that it doesn't teach real spiritual work. It just indoctrinates its followers with dogma and beliefs. Alright, that about sums it up for blue. Stay tuned for the 5th level, where we will be talking about stage orange, the next level. Thank you all for watching, and have an awesome day.